Okay, welcome to the November 1st Student Achievement and District Instructional Performance Committee of the Whole for the Cincinnati Public Schools. We welcome everyone who is in attendance and ask everyone to please silence their cell phones and electronic devices. Ms. Wagner, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Bolton? Present. Mr. Craig?
Here.
Ms. Jones? Here. Dr. Moffitt? Mr. Morosky? Mrs. Weinberg? Here. President Lindy?
Here. Want to thank everybody for coming. We'll transition to our presentations and discussions in just a moment. Would just call everybody's attention to a few things on our agenda. As is always the case, we have our goals and guardrails listed at the top of the agenda. These are the 5 most important student outcomes and the 6 most important values that are guiding our district and our strategic plan over the next several years. So you should see those at the beginning of really every meeting that we have as a full board. You will also see below that the 3 priorities that our board set for how we spend our time between now and the end of this calendar year. There are 3 of those. One is about continuing to progress monitor these goals and guardrails and providing an accountability function. That's how we're going to be spending almost all of our time this afternoon. In other meetings, we are very focused on sharing and reinforcing the budget context and process for this upcoming budget cycle. And then lastly, we're going to be reviewing and deciding on the ad hoc committee's recommendations before the end of this calendar year. So as one of our governance coaches shares with us, what happens in the boardroom is reflected in the classroom. We are trying very hard here to get clear on what matters most for students and align our time in such a way that we're doing the most good for students in the time that we have. And so with that, we will transition to our first. We have basically a one, I'm not going to use the word long, but like medium presentation, and then one short one. So we'll get started with the longer one.
Thank you, President Lindy. So we'll start today. We have a goals and guardrails update today, and we also have one that's coming on the 6th. So today, you've received the information for the goals and guardrails for today. So we'll start there. Today's update is focused on a goal 1 interims goals for 1 and 2, guardrail 4 and 5, and the interims as well. And then in our next meeting, we'll focus on goal 4 and the interim data for that, and guardrail 2 and the interims. I also would like to call our attention on this slide. At the very bottom of the slide, you notice the goals, targets, and values have been adjusted based on the actual data 22-23. These are technical adjustments to reflect accuracy in the numbers. The adjustments can be seen here. So if you'll click that link for me, please. When we initially did our goals and guardrails, you can see this in your presentation view on the document that I shared earlier, and it's also on the presentation here. If you recall, when we did the goals and guardrails, we were doing the goals based on what we thought the numbers might be. However, we have been able to update the data. Remember, we did the goals and guardrails in December, and that was before we got our actual data in October. So the update reflects the actual numbers versus the numbers that we were estimating at that time. So we left it so that it was showing the red numbers so that you would see the changes based on what the conversations were during the time that we did the actual goals and guardrails in December. Want to make sure there's clarity around what that means before we move farther. Okay, great. So if we'll go to our first slide. Thank you. The next slide, please. Okay, the goal 1, the percent of third graders proficient in reading on the Ohio State test will increase from 47.5% in June of 2023 to 61% by June of 2027. So our overall target for 2027 is 61%. So when we look at this goal, as we thought about the interim goals that would go along with this goal, we wanted to focus specifically on our school year 23 first grade students, because that allow us to look at a cohort of students and how that cohort of students was moving through the data. A lot of noticings for us in going through this particular data set and wonderings around whether or not that is the best interim goal to look at, but that's what we will be reviewing throughout this year. So as we get started, we see that for our students last year, those students were in the first grade in the fall, and their percentage on track at that time at the beginning of the fall was 27.6%. Those same students are now second graders at this time, and in the fall, when they did the beginning of the year assessment in the fall, their percentage was 19.8%. And so the initial change with that is about 7.8%. It's relevant in that the material that students would review as a first grader in terms of their preparation and what they would be looking at as a second grader is not quite the same. However, we do want to see the cohort increase whenever they're taking assessment. So right now, that particular Goal 1 measure, we believe, is not on track as we look at just overall, just the decline. When we look collectively at each of the areas, and from the beginning of the year, iReady reading assessment, we noticed that there was a decline for the grade level. And so one of the things that a grade level for each of the subgroups across the grade level. So one of the things that we meet in the coming week with our iReady team. And one of the things that we do want to discuss as a part of this guardrail is there a piece that maybe we're not looking at the right way in thinking about what we should expect from the first grade students and what that assessment should look like from the second grade students that are within that same cohort. So this would be an area for us to continue monitoring and also look at where those same students are when they take the mid-year assessment, because that's one of the things that will look at some of the differences at that point. If we'll go to our next. I'm sorry. Okay, so for our next one, this is specific as we think about our focus on our Black students, specifically as it relates to the overall gap that we have with our students across the board, academic gap, disciplinary gap, which we'll talk about a bit as well. But this is specific to our Black students as well. If the overall target is not on track, when we look at that population for our Black students, overall the number was 18.9% for our Black students as first graders in the fall, and right now that's 11.1. And so this would be an area where collectively we're still off track in terms of thinking about that interim goal that we're looking at around overall goal 1 of our third grade students being at the 61% by 2027. Next slide. And the same for our Hispanic students, because we were pulling out each of the populations, and it's the same. In the fall, our Hispanic students last year were 14.3%, and right now they're at 9.9%. So looking at the overall declines as we think about that, the goal for them by 24-25 at the beginning of third grade is at that 21%. But again, we look at the data again in the mid-year and then really track through the year as to whether or not this is the best interim goal for us to look at as we think about getting to the overall goal. So now we move to goal 2. And for goal 2, this allows us to focus on the current gap in reading proficiency between our 6th grade African American, Hispanic, and multiracial students and our 6th grade white students on the Ohio State test. And we want to shrink that gap from 47.4% in June of 2023 to 27% by 2027. Another area that we see, and this one was hard for me to make sure we left it marked off track because essentially it's the same number. So in the fall, our multiracial students were at 54.2% last year, and now they're at 54. As 5th graders, they're at 54.1%. So it's the a tenth of a percentage point that would say that that makes it off track, but to just remain true to the decline, we wanted to leave it off track. But that's one that we're feeling a little more hopeful about because we don't have the same, we're not seeing the same thing in the data from the fall of 2022 to the fall of 2023. Next slide takes us to the 2B interim goal for that particular one, and this is for our Black students. And we do see that there was an increase for our Black students from the 29.6% in the fall of 2022 to 30%, 30.2, so about a 0.6% change from the fall to fall as we think about our Black students in the reference to all of the students. And so we are seeing that we are on track in this particular area as we look at just the data from the fall to the fall. For our Hispanic students, not so much, really close, but it's not the same. So we do feel like we're off track in this area. The benchmark started last year at 23.8 and currently at 23.2. We notice as we think about 2C, and you see the same thing on the 2B slide, but for all students, we had a slight increase. For our Black students, we had a point change of 3.3. For our white students, we had a point change of 1.7. And then our multiracial students, there was a bit of a decline, and our special needs students, a decline as well. So while this particular interim looks just at our Hispanic students, I did want to call out the other areas as we think about where the changes are. Before we go into our guardrails, I want to stop here with just those goals so we can open up for questions.
Thank you, Superintendent. Board members who have questions. Vice President Craig.
Just a clarifying point. On the slides that you just went through, on one slide it says that the Black students were at 26.9, and on another slide it says it's at 29.6. So I just want to clarify which one.
It's actually 29.6. I don't know if my dyslexia caught up with me. So let's make sure I'm looking at the same thing. If we'll go back to 29.6, okay. Let's do, I think we're on goal 2. I think you're talking about goal 2.
Yes.
So on goal 2, our Black students were at 29.6 for last school year, for 2022.
Okay, but on the slide right before this on 2A, it had it as 26.9.
If you'll go to 2A for me. Yeah, okay, wait a minute now.
So I just know if it's just
fourth grade. Well, this was fourth grade multiracial, and want to make sure that 2B is fourth grade as well. Okay, that's an error. Let's go back. The actual number is 29.6, and so I want to make sure that we update that because that number should be 29.6.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll correct that.
Thank you.
If you'll go back for the slide as well, to Dr. Moffitt's point, yes, the change would be different. The change would be 0.6 versus the 3.3. The 0.6 that we see on slide number 9 that's under the 2B.
Thank you, Vice President Craig. Thank you, Superintendent. Other questions from board members? I was hoping, Superintendent, you could share a little bit about, I think you shared some, but could you say a little bit more just about any theories on why the incoming figure for the same kids in second grade is lower than we were expecting?
Yeah, so the first thing that I would think, knowing about the assessment, is the scale score for the expectation for a second grader is different than the scale score for an expectation of a first grader. So you're expecting that the second grader is going to start slightly higher as we look at the projection as you're looking toward getting to grade level than a first grader would start. So when you're thinking comparing apples to apples, you're looking at the same exact cohort of students. We're doing it as cohorts, but some of the students may be different. When you're looking at the same group of students, your hope would be that those students at least start at the same place that they ended the year before. But this is looking at the fall from the beginning of a first grade student to what you would expect for a student to be at the end of first grade. So another, a better indicator would be, and we're digging into that a little bit more. I'm thinking that a better indicator might be where the students were in the fall as a in the spring as a first grade student versus where they end up in the fall as a second grade student, because the difference in the gap of the time is only about 3 months versus an actual year in terms of thinking about where their overall performance would be. So I'm not 100% sure at this point. That's just one of the theories that I have, knowing how the tests modulate. It is both diagnostic and prescriptive for the students, but as you go up in grade levels, there is the expectation that the performance of the students goes up as well for them to be considered on grade level. So I'm believing that a better indicator for us would be where they are mid-year, but this is one of the questions that I really want to ask our iReady partners as we start talking about really disaggregating the data even more.
Thank you. Other questions for the superintendent? Mrs. Weinberg.
Yes, Superintendent Wright, I just have a quick question. So as I'm looking at this data for first grade into second, then they will be third graders. Would you say that the change of the test also may have affected the scores, being that those students particularly were taking the math reading and now taking the iReady? What year are we in terms of changing over to the iReady reading?
So the data for 22 is based on iReady, but it's based on iReady as a first grader.
Right, so this would be their first year taking it, iReady?
Last year.
Last year
So
would have been the
data,
first year, so it would be second year.
Correct.
Okay.
And they're taking it the second year at this point as a second grader. And we are comparing we're comparing iReady to iReady here, not iReady to OST.
And we are making sure in terms of, I know before, schools had choices to decide whether they wanted to use iReady last year. So currently this year, they are all using it.
All students use iReady this year, correct?
Thank you.
Any other questions before we go to the guardrails?
Ms. Bolton.
It's just I guess it's a question, of course, a concern always that I have is that as assessments change, it's hard to do the comparison, to follow it. I mean, you'd expect to see something change because you don't know how reliable it is when there's different assessments and and indeed, like you point out, different expectations of a second grader versus a first grader. So I always have a little bit of a worry. I also worry a little bit where I see other districts doing this, and I know we've done it in the past too in an effort to get the kind of outcomes we're looking for. There's a heavy concentration on those subjects that are most tested. And indeed, what starts to happen is that in some districts, we start to teach less of other subjects and topics. And of course, I'm saying that from a social studies perspective. I'm not make no complaints about that. Yes. And I don't know, I'm starting to pick up that some people are sensing that we're doing that, maybe in the elementary, that maybe science is a little less important than it was, and not through your administration, but over the years as we're kind of focusing on these outcomes. And that indeed, to get some of these outcomes that we're looking for, we might be devoting more resources, personnel and time and whatever, but sometimes that starts to diminish the overall education. I didn't know if you'd have a chance to talk a little bit about that, since they actually are supposed to be helping each other in a child's achievement. But
I would definitely say in doing individual conversations with principals and in going into schools starting, May 2nd of 2022, you do see in most schools more reading. You did see at that point, I would say, more reading and math taught than other subjects in elementary school environments. What we noticed last year as we got the new curriculum last year, that there was more, so social studies in many of our grade levels at the elementary level is integrated. So there's been a lot of work between the social studies team and the ELA team to make certain that there is a marriage between the expectations for reading, ELA writing, and the expectation for social studies. So, and one of the best ways to say it is you're working with teaching the content through an ELA or a reading lens, even though the content may be social studies content. So I'm comfortable saying at this point we're seeing more of that, and that had already started in terms of the work behind that. The implementation is something that we've been able to focus on over the last year. I will definitely say that in our higher grades, you're seeing more science, but in the higher grades, you're seeing even more of it now in elementary than you would see in some of the younger grades. And so since we've had the new curriculum, we just got the new curriculum last year, as you know, and we're beginning to see the early signs of implementation of the science curriculum in our earlier grades as well, but you do see more of it. And again, you're right. I mean, it goes back to that area of focus, what individuals feel more comfortable with, what is actually being tested. I don't think it's just something that we have had challenges with in our district, but we're beginning to see more content-specific work done in the classes, and we're monitoring it more. So I think that there has been an improvement in that area, but I think if you would talk to most leaders or talk to some of the teachers in schools, they would say over the course of the years, it depends on the comfort of what's happening at the school, what's really being taught or not. And now there's more of an expectation that the coursework is being taught.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, we'll keep moving. Thanks, Superintendent.
So now we will go into the guardrails, and for some of these guardrails, these were, we're establishing the expectation. The first is the superintendent shall not propose or recommend the acquisition or distribution of resources that are unanalyzed or unrated for quality or the favorite status granted to local, women, or minority marketplace providers of goods or services. So that's the guardrail. The guardrail 4A, in terms of the interim guardrail that we are looking at for this, is the percentage of our suppliers meeting diversity criteria RFP solicitations will increase from 46.2% in May of 2023 to 50% in May of 2025. And if you recall, when we talked about this one as even a guardrail and how we might look at the interim guardrail that goes along with that, there are certain things that we cannot require when it comes to the diversity indexes. So we cannot require, or we cannot say that it has to be this number, or it has to be this number, because that causes challenges with the law. But we can look at how we are doing more solicitation across the board. And so in this particular area, we're establishing the target. The actual for this one for 22 was 46.2, and for 23-24, that actual was 48%. So as we've established the target, we believe that 50% is the direction that we're looking to go. And right now we're at 48% for this particular interim for the guardrail. Next one. Similar to the last was referencing RFPs, and this is specific to our approved vendor list. And we want to make sure that we're increasing in the diversity criteria on the approved vendor list from 74.2% in May of 2023 to 80% in May of 2025. And so again, thinking about the number of diverse lenders that you have on the list gives more of an opportunity for goods and services from those individuals. And for the 22-23, the actual was 74.2%, and for 23-24, the actual for 22-23 was 74.2%, and our current is listed as target, but the current is 77% for where we are right now. The other thing that's important here is that, if you notice in the note, the prior data is not available because it was all reported and tracked manually. So that's why we don't have information here. Also, counts may be duplicated because a vendor can also meet multiple diversity criteria. So you may have one set of numbers in the denominator, but they can count in multiple areas in the numerator. So that's the target that's still establishing. We'll continue to monitor again over the year as to whether or not this is the right interim guardrail to look at for this particular overall guardrail, but that's where we're starting right now. Let's go back to that one to see if there are any questions about that one, because the next one goes into chronic absenteeism.
Any questions on the first two interim guardrails? Ms. Bolton?
As it pertains to the diversity piece, it's listed here as local. Does the local vendor or whatever, or suppliers or what have you, that enters, that's part of the diversity piece, correct? So we're measuring that, not just minority or indeed women. We're also measuring local as well.
Local is measured as well, but it's all measured as an or. So local or women or minority or small, depending on how they identify.
What's the last one you said?
If you'll go back, please.
Oh, okay.
Small was the other, as a small business.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. Other questions? Dr. Moffitt?
Can you remind me how we got the increase amount? Like, how did we get to the target number? I think I asked President Lindy this before, but how did we get to a target of 77 and a target of 80%? How did we get there?
So if you will go back to the guardrail. So in the the board provided the overall guardrail, and for us, as we looked at the what we were thinking about the interim guardrails would be to help us meet this overall guardrail, we looked at where we started and what would consider to be a B, I guess is the best way to say it, what would consider to be better than average for the other end. And so we rated that at an 80%. And so that was just, it was based on the data that we had to start with and how much we thought we could impact that by, that 2 years out. So there was not a specific formula that was used for this area. It was more, the board gave the overall guardrail. From that, these were the interim guardrails that we were looking at. And then based on the data that we have, in a couple of years, really focusing and making sure that we're being intentional about the area where might we be able to see the most growth.
So I think the board just set the overarching, and then the administration set a parameter, set the actual quantitative number.
That's
correct?
right.
So in the process, is there an opportunity where is the opportunity for review of that? Because specifically around this particular guardrail, I'm very interested in, and I understand that they're ORs, but I'm very interested in disaggregating that because I remember we had a very lengthy discussion around local. And so this doesn't tell that story. It just says, hey, it's all lumped together and you could have a significant amount in minority and not local, but it's all lumped together. So I think I'm asking, where in this process is there an opportunity for the board to quantify or adjust that targeted number to be reflective of something that it's more collaborative?
So I think that, and I want to make sure that I understand your question. So if we'll go back to the guardrails, as I understand the overall process, just like the interim goals, once we set the guardrails, then administratively it becomes our responsibility to determine what those guardrails are that will get us to these what those interim guardrails are that will get us to the overall goal, overall guardrail. And so in terms of doing that, this is the one that we actually selected as a way to address each of those areas. I think as we go through the monitoring of that this year, throughout the year, monitoring now, doing it again at the second time that we monitor the guardrail, and then assess over the course of that time, what we're really trying to get at here, then we can determine whether or not that's a guardrail that we need to update to address a different area, because the overall guardrail asks for or versus one or more specific to the other.
Okay. I think I'm probably, maybe my question is more, I do understand. I just thought that maybe we would have a stretch where they just seem very safe, to be honest with you. Some of the numbers seem rather safe, just a 2% increase and a 3% increase. So I'm wondering, when is the opportunity for there to be a review of the quantitative goal so that maybe we can stretch a little bit? That's all. in the process. So I don't know that part. And I asked this a couple months ago, so you can verify, like, how did we come up with those numbers? And
Yeah, no, I'm happy to share. I know Superintendent wants to respond, and then I know Ms. Jones has a question too. So maybe we'll go Superintendent, and then I'm happy to share, and then we'll go to.
The only thing that I'll add here, if you go back to the next slide, the goals and the guardrails right now are set up for a 2027 expectation based on what the board voted on to start with. To give an opportunity to do update, if you'll notice each one of our interim guardrails, we only set up to 2025. So that once we get to that point, then we'll be able to look at that area, see if that is still meeting the expectation, and then update to get where necessary for the 2027 timeline. So these are, it's almost like an interim goal within an interim goal, because 2027 is the entire period of time, but we really are only looking at that 2-year window of time, so that as we are continuing to move, grow, and develop, we can do updates from the end of that, that 2 years to where it needs to go for the next 2 years. I think this one may feel like a safe target to start with as well, but we also had to do a lot of baseline information here. And I think it's important for us to determine what is the national standard, what is the expectation as we think about, where we are in this area nationally, and using that as additional feedback from the board as we're determining how to make the necessary update.
I completely agree. I just didn't know when you said to make the necessary feedback from the board, I was trying to find out where that is, because I don't see it. And I've asked this question before, like, how did we come up with those numbers? And I didn't get a clear, definitive answer, but I'm anxious to hear President Lindy's response.
Sure. So when we did the retreat with Cindy and Ray on August 30th, and I think they'd shared this in the past before, that although the board approves the goals with the targets, when it comes to the guardrails, the board approves guardrail language, and then the superintendent is then the one who comes up with the targets around the interim guardrails. So it's a distinction between board role on the goals side and board roles on the guardrail side. So we can certainly ask Cindy or Ray next time we have them with us, but it's a part of the student outcomes focused governance framework that has it's an asymmetry on the goals side with board involvement and then the interim goals. And I happen to also like the idea of ambition, to your point, Dr. Moffitt, and I like the idea, Superintendent, of first let's get to a B and then let's raise the bar even higher. I also know that Ms. Jones has been waiting patiently and had something she wanted to share.
So I'm not finished with my question, but if just 1 second. So my question is still kind of open in that, where is the board's role in reassessing that quantitative number if the board ever felt that number, that interim goal was not, or it should be stretched for a particular year? So that's a question you shared first, Ray and Cindy, but I've asked that question before and I still am a little unclear. If we could just ask them, that'd be great.
Gosh, I'm sorry. I thought that was exactly the question we just answered. So part of the board doesn't set interim guardrails. The board sets the goals. The superintendent sets the interim guardrails.
So if the board feels that the interim guardrail should be different, where is the board's role in working with the administration to reassess that?
So the way the board would handle that is the board would rewrite the guardrail. So a majority of board members would need to say, this is not in line with the value we're trying to represent from the community. So we're going to get clearer on the language of the guardrail. And then we would give that to the administration to take the target from it so that it would be more in line with what the community's values are.
For the interim.
Correct.
I'm just speaking of the interim, not the
That's right.
actual.
That's right.
Thank you.
So, and sorry, Ms. Jones.
I'm really confused because I thought that the board did not have a role in writing the interim.
That's correct.
We're saying the same thing.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
So I know superintendent, and then I know that you had, I think, a totally independent question you wanted to ask also. Okay. Soup, and then
I think what I think, and this is valuable feedback, I think, for us for me as administration. But I think one of the things that I would want to know, even though I think we all understand that the administration owns the interim guardrails, I do think that it's important to clarify what that particular overall guardrail was trying to get at and what additional information the board might be asking for or might allow that might be responsive to whatever question is not being answered. And so the board wrote the guardrail as an or, so therefore we receive the guardrail as an or. If there is more interest in one or the other, what part would that be? And so then we can determine if that is something that we can include as a part of the share out.
I appreciate that. And I think my question has transformed and metamorphosized, but I'm asking simply, where is the process? Where in the process is there reflection for the board to go back and say exactly what you said? Hey, there's, like Eve's question was about local. So I thought we had a very extensive conversation about wanting a desire for local. But if that wasn't clear, and you clarified it was written as or, if that wasn't clear, where in the process is it that the board would go back and say, hey, we really want to make sure that we want local to be emphasized and maybe make it an and, but I don't see that. So my question was clear. I wasn't talking about the board interjecting in the interim. I was saying, where in the process is it that the board would go back to clarify or revisit or just say, hey, you know what, we did say that, we set this goal, but we want you to maybe focus on that. And it doesn't have to change the goal or the guardrail per se, but it's just to emphasize that there's wanting more clarity about that. So that was my question a couple months ago, and that's actually, thank you for answering that, because
and I think we can do that in a couple of different ways. I mean, I think at any board meeting, if a board member has a motion that they want to make to change the language to it, we could do that in any meeting, I think, including this one. And I think if people wanted some time to think about it and plan ahead a little bit, we could also work together to get that on an upcoming meeting agenda. And we could do that as early as, our next meeting or two, but certainly before the calendar year's over. Does that answer the question? Okay. Ms. Jones?
Yeah, before I ask my question, I just want to say that I'm really trying to pay attention to the question and understand it. So I feel like I kind of got caught up in maybe some confusion on Dr. Moffitt's question, but my point was from my perspective of the way I was hearing the question. So I wanted to be clear about that. So it wasn't, I think you felt like that I was attacking what you were saying, and I wasn't. I was just trying to understand how the question was being formed based on my knowledge and my understanding of what your question was. So having said that, as I look at the guardrail and some of the terminology that's used, Superintendent, it might be helpful to clarify, not only for myself, but for the general public. When we talk, we first say, so this guardrail is defined as the acquisition and distribution of resources. So, but we use the terminology suppliers, vendors, and the other term that isn't in here is contractors. And I think vendors and suppliers are used interchangeably. So for clarity purposes, this includes, this particular guardrail is only inclusive of things that we purchase, any types of services or resources that support the district. It does not necessarily include contractors who might be providing services for our students, like educational services, or does it?
So this essentially would include anything that we are purchasing, that we are paying for. Okay. Anything that we're paying for. So whether it's what we're recommending, the acquisition, i.e. we're paying for it, or the distribution of it in terms of overall resources. So it could include, if we have a contract with someone and they are providing a resource or a service and we're paying for it, they would be included in this guardrail.
I think it's helpful to understand that, because I think our general public doesn't necessarily always understand the distinctions in those definitions, how we define that. So that was helpful.
And this is one, and I know that there was a lot of conversation on the board around this, but this is also one that it's so broad. There's such a level of importance to it, but it's so broad as we think about how we actually go in and define that this is actually happening. And so the one way for us to do that is to look at, as we're thinking about resource, and then this was just our thought as we were thinking through the interim, as we're thinking about our resources, how do we get our resources? We get our resources by utilizing an RFP process. We get our resources by having an approved vendor list. And when we think about that, if we're trying to honor local, women, minority, all of the things that were put in the guardrail, then it allows us to go back and analyze that data in terms of each of those areas.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Thank you, Superintendent. Any other questions here so far? Ms. Bolton?
Yeah, I'm totally committed to interim belongs elsewhere. I'm okay with that, especially as it pertains to instruction. And that's just me being an old teacher and saying the folks that do this for a living need to do it. But looking at our preoccupation with return on investment and looking at the use of resources, and I've already said, I think a couple of meetings ago, about my concerns about incremental growth within the interims, just because it doesn't necessarily do that. It's a good strategy or tactic, makes sense. I'm not arguing it. But when you look at the amount of money that we have now invested in, as you point out in the presentation, in the social workers and also in the APs of culture, it would almost have, to justify that cost, we'd almost have to see something more than incremental. It would seem to me, that's from a finance standpoint, not necessarily an instructional standpoint. And so that's just, it's a comment that, because really there better be some big happening as a result, hopefully, because I believe in what we've done and what you've advised to do, but I think that might be one of those rare examples where I might even enter into any interest about interims. The other real quick question on the attendance, and frankly, if we could just get the kids here, we probably would have accomplished more than any of us would ever hope.
Ms. Bolton, we haven't done that part of the presentation yet. Are you open to holding it until we get the slides?
I'm jumping ahead because I have a question on the different categories that we've used to divide the student population. Will you be able to have we done any study as to why there is a difference, or analysis, just moving ahead when we disaggregate these kids? Are you trying to analyze it? That's just generically.
Okay.
Maybe a short thought now, and then we'll do the slides, and then we'll hear a little more.
I think analysis has just started. So let's go through, if we can go to guardrail 5. There is so much, I think, that we have learned through really digging into this particular guardrail. The one thing that I will just share in terms of the first year, in terms of the first year of any level of implementation, is you really want to spend, especially when you're talking about these kinds of things, you really want to spend that year focused on data integrity. And so in a lot of instances, you see data, and we talked about this when we talked about discipline, but in a lot of areas, you see data increase, or i.e. get worse, if you will, when you're talking about the affective things, attendance, discipline, because you want to remain true to data integrity. You see those things go up sometimes before you see them go down. So that would just be the only thing I would caution us around as we begin to think through it. And I'll tell you why I even say that a little bit about my concerns about our chronic absenteeism data as we've really been digging into this area and what we may see that happens as we move forward. So the superintendent will not ignore district-wide chronic absenteeism at school sites, paying special attention to family involvement. So chronic absenteeism is when a student misses 10% or more days in the school year. And I wanted to include this particular chart because our district is a bit unique in that we don't have the same number of days in each quarter. So those days vary a little bit from quarter to quarter. So I wanted you to be able to see how that changes. The other thing that is really unique about the state of Ohio when it comes to chronic absenteeism is our state calculates chronic absenteeism at the hour, not at the day or at the half day. So, I'm sorry? Right, so the challenge with that becomes in our elementary schools, that's at about a 6, we think about it in terms of 6 hours. At our high schools, it's based on periods, but overall it's still 6 hours. So there are some lessons to be learned through that process because a lot is expected in terms of record keeping when it comes to the disaggregation or the sharing of data at the hourly level. So wanted to address that first. So we can go to the next slide. So this guardrail is the percent of K-12 students with chronic absenteeism will decrease from 45.9% in May of 2023 to 36% by May of 2025. The average, and you'll see this on the slide, and for those that have already looked through the deck, you've likely already seen it. The average chronic absenteeism across urban school districts is about 30%. So I just want us to use that as the number, which is a number that is alarming across the board. But when we think about urban school districts, that's the data that's provided based on urban school districts. If we look at our chronic absenteeism data for this past year, for May 2023, trying to get to the 36 at May 2025, from the fall of last year, that number was 45.9. And right now at Q1, we see a reduction of 7.3% from there. So that gives us some opportunity and some focus as we think about where we're looking to go with the target. But I did want to make sure that we clarify that the 22-23 number is for the entire school year. So that's the same number that was calculated into our report card. The 23-24 quarter is just for Q1. Just in terms of overall clarification. So that's where we were for all of our students in terms of thinking about the overall percentages, if we'll go to the next. Then looking specifically at our Black students with chronic absenteeism decreasing, 53.2% in May of 2023 to 39.2% in May of 2025. And so far we have an 8.5% decrease for our Black students in chronic absenteeism, and that is based on the first quarter. We're able to look as you look down the rest of the list, you're able to see what that looks like for all of our other populations. We notice across the board, with the exception of multiracial, we did have a decline in chronic absenteeism, at least based on the end of the school year for where we are right now. So we do see that as an area still being on track. Same for our Hispanic students. We had a decline for our Hispanic students as well, and from 44% to 38%, which gives us about 6% in terms of an overall decline. So a couple of things to point out here, and this is really related to the statement that Board Member Bolton made earlier. So this data is based on our chronic absenteeism numbers for last year. And one of the things to call out here, we know our non-APCC schools, and that was Assistant Principal of Culture and Community. Those are pretty much our magnet schools, right? So that would include Gamble, Clark, SCPA, Spencer, Walnut Hills. The chronic absenteeism number for those particular schools was less than 30%. So the attendance in those schools obviously is better than our neighborhood schools. When you look at the point difference though, there's about a 40-point spread between the chronic absenteeism in our magnet schools and the chronic absenteeism in our neighborhood schools. So that was one of the reasons that we really wanted to look at a more comprehensive focus on those schools where, almost 2/3 of the students are chronically absent. So that just gives a little more information about where we were and why we really wanted to focus in those areas. Just another data point that we're looking at. As we think about where we are right now, we see that going from where we were last year to where we are now, across the board, we do see that we've had a bit of a decline, at least for the quarter one. So for example, all of the schools were at 65% at the end of the year for our schools that have an assistant principal of culture and community and the social work position. And for quarter one for those same schools, it declined to 58.2%. So, 6%, anytime you get over about a 2% increase one way or the other, depending on the targeted population, it becomes one that's significant in terms of thinking about change. Not where we want to be, but beginning to see some initial improvement in that particular space. We'll go to the next slide. The other thing that I also wanted to provide here for you, and that was the update that I sent. If you go over to the link that says data for all schools can be seen here. So I did list out here for you the data for the high schools because we know that we have a greater challenge. Well, we would think we have a greater challenge in high schools around chronic absenteeism. I'm sorry, if you'll go back, Rob, right down to the right where it says data for all schools can be seen right there. Thank you. So this gives the data for all of the schools in the district back to 18-19 around chronic absenteeism, not just the high schools. So that way you're able to see in a very historical way what the chronic absenteeism was prior to COVID and how that's changed as, a byproduct of COVID. And across the board, most school districts are still trying to get students back in school. But that was information that I did want to make sure that you did have at your availability so that you were able to review that. If we'll go back to the other slide. Thank you. So the other thing that we're seeing, at least in our first quarter, now we are taking the data from the aggregate of all the schools that have an assistant principal of culture and community and the social work position to looking at individual schools. And I think as you're beginning to look at the schools, looking at the point change at the individual schools, many of them are pretty significant. If I call out specifically, Dater High School so far has a decrease of about 20 points in terms of thinking about, they were at 64% and right now it's only at 44%, still high, but trending in the right direction. Another to call out in terms of the double digit change is at Withrow as well. So looking at 73%, almost 75% of the students were chronically absent at the end of the year for Withrow. And right now, at 54%, again, not where we want to be, but we're beginning to see where we're seeing some improvements. If we'll go to the next. And this is just the rest of the schools. So the schools on the first slide are the schools that have the assistant principal of culture and community and have the social worker. The schools on this slide, only SCPA and virtual high school have the attendant social worker. On this particular slide, and they don't, and none of these schools have the assistant principal of culture and community at those schools. So did want to call that out. Also want to share on this slide is Lighthouse is an asterisk here because we know the low number of students that we have at Lighthouse, but when you see the reduction of about 32.6%, it does cause some questions. So I did want to make sure that that was elevated for you. Next slide. So as we think about where we are in terms of chronic absenteeism across the Ohio 8, we have the third best, if that's a way to say it, we have the third best chronic absenteeism rate among the Ohio 8. Canton is at 40%. Toledo is at 42, about 43%, and then we're next at 46%. And I think our initial target is, of course, to get us to at least the 30%, because that would at least put us in alignment with other urban school districts. I did want to call out, however, the question where we can pull this information moving forward, because we did have the questions around the Ohio 8 and how we compare to the state. We will include that data for the state. And so right now that data for the state is at 26.8%. In this slide also, I included for the team, the Fordham Institute did an analysis of Ohio chronic absenteeism at the very bottom of that slide. Rob, if you'll click there. And this gives some very specific information that is based on our state. If you'll scroll down, and we did put this data on the next slide, but I did want to point this out. If you'll notice this particular slide, or on this particular chart, and it is in the PowerPoint as well, prior to COVID, the chronic absenteeism rate in the state was 16.7%. As of last school year, it was at 26.8%. And that's across Ohio. So there are a lot of different, there's a lot of different information here about, you know, some of the changes that have occurred, but even in the overall state, the state has not gotten back to the pre-pandemic data around chronic absenteeism. Thank you. If you'll go back to the slide. All right, as we go to the next, so this one I just kind of shared out a second ago, where we have seen some increases and decreases in terms of chronic absenteeism across the state. So it has the changes, of course, it just continues to remind us of the negative impact that COVID had on all of us. Next slide. So as we think about overall next steps and putting all of the goals and guardrails together, and I'm going to start with attendance because that's the one that we just did. So let me go back first because there may be questions instead of going here. If we'll go back to the questions around chronic absenteeism, let me stop there.
Questions on chronic absenteeism? Mr. Moreski.
Thank you, President Lindy. And Superintendent, thank you so much for this. And I was just talking with Mr. Hoying before the meeting about chronic absenteeism, so I figured I'd give everybody an update. I've asked Ms. Davis to put this on for the next policy meeting in November. It's the last one of the year, just to offer any assistance an explicit chronic absenteeism policy could offer you and your team. I don't know if it could, and the teachers, of course, to enforce and get kids to school. As Ms. Bolton's reminded me since I got here 6 years ago, she brings up absenteeism a lot and attendance a lot. And it seems pretty intuitive that if we could figure out how to solve this, then we could do everything else, because we know once we have the students, we do a great job. I always kind of think of it as like the most difficult social determinant that we deal with because there's so many factors, right? My son's friends are not always at school. His same friends are not always at school, and it's going to be like that, you know, the whole time he's there. And so I know they're not getting the same experience he's getting, which is a really, really good one. And he's fortunate. So we can figure this out. I just want you to know that in policy, we'll be talking about it in November. And so if we can offer assistance in that manner, I know my colleagues and I would love to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moreski. Mrs. Weinberg.
Yeah, so I just have one quick question. Superintendent, if we could go to slide 16. I'm not sure if that's the slide that's on the screen. It is? Okay, perfect. My one concern, and I know that you're getting ready to talk about some possible next steps, as you're looking at that special education line here, I'm just noticing how that is extremely still high, and just trying to figure out what are some, I guess, things that we can do for that particular set of population of students to ensure that they are coming to school, because when they're not here at school, obviously they're not getting the services that they need.
Yeah, so I don't know if we're at a place where we can really pull out one population versus the other, because chronic absenteeism is such an issue across the district. I think where what you'll see on the upcoming slides, I think there are a few places. One, it's really around educating families and caregivers around the attendance piece. Because as I share, in our state, chronic absenteeism, while it's the equivalent of 10% out of school, is calculated hourly. So if you have a family that a child comes to school late because they had a doctor's appointment, and they get picked up early because they have to go to grandma's house after school, the state doesn't allow you to give credit for both of those times. So that child is considered absent, and that's in elementary school, is considered absent for that period of time. So I think one is really doing some education around, even if you're going to be late getting to school, it's important to still go. Even if you have to be picked up in the middle of the day, it's important to go back, because all of those individual hours add up. I think the other thing that is also equally important is, as we really dig into, and the team will share this with you, I ask a lot of really deep questions around our own system and processes. And there's one of our systems right now that we really want to work with our teachers on, that's a bit broken when we think about attendance. Because attendance, it requires, right now we default to present if attendance is not taken. It is the expectation that attendance is taken. If the teacher has taken attendance and the child at the beginning of the period is not there, when the child shows up, the teacher is expected to go back into the system and update that the child was late, but put the time that they returned, that they actually came in. That's really, really work intensive when you think about what teachers are already doing in class. And so a part of the question, and one of the areas that I really have the team really digging in around right now is there a better system that we could use? We know that if we had the IDs that we referred to earlier, it gave so many different options and opportunities for being able to kind of check in class and check out. We're not at that space. So how do we make that really more efficient and also make it more productive? Because this does say that there are likely students that do show up to school, that are showing up to school late or show up to class late that we're not capturing in the data. I think the third, in terms of where we also begin to focus and where policy may be able to help, there are a lot of places where there is a moratorium on the time that students can be picked up in the afternoon. And so some schools do that now just because of after school, transportation, right? When you're trying to get 500 students out of the school, you can't have everybody coming in to pick students up as well. But it's something to think about if there's something that we actually could kind of institute across the district around that, how it may offer additional assistance. So those would be three things that I would think about in terms of that space. I also want to make sure that when we look at special education, we're talking about all special education students. So it's any child that has an IEP. Most of our students that have IEPs are served in general ed classrooms, or they're served in cross-categorical classrooms. They're not served in your low incidence programs. That's the minority of our population. That's generally not where we see the attendance issue. The attendance issue generally is with your students that are being served in regular ed classrooms with their regular ed peers, and they're having some of their regular ed peers challenges.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mrs. Weinberg. Ms. Bolton.
Yeah, now that we're on the part of the agenda that I had already skipped to, but I'll be brief, sort of. The difference among the schools.
Yes.
We're kind of hoping, I'm assuming that that's because of programming or additional extracurricular activities, which actually draws kids to school as much as anything does.
Rob, can you pull up the chronic absenteeism school list, please? Thank you.
I'm wondering if in those schools where we have better attendance or less chronic absenteeism, it might be an interesting thing to kind of look at economic diversity within those schools. I mean, I think that's got to be part of the situation, because I'm concluding that there's greater diversity in those schools than maybe in our other schools, whatever diversity may mean, but at least more of an economic mix of students. And the other piece of that for the attendance, I would assume that attendance for all intents and purposes really isn't taken in many ways and many times. I mean, I wouldn't interrupt my class in order to clerk in and clerk out when whether I'm doing something really exciting or something that needs doing. So I think an investment in some way of being aware about not the badges for security, but the actual presence of students would be a very wise investment if for no other reason we could focus on the kids that we really need to focus on. But I told Carolyn when we started this topic too, I said, I don't have a lot of faith in any of the numbers just because of all of that and how stupid the state is in determining what's attendance and what isn't attendance. But I'm also going to remind us that we all had to fight hard to get this as our 6th goal. And I think we were right to do so. So, and I appreciate this. This is as comprehensive as I've ever seen from the district on attendance. And I appreciate it because this is it. They got to get here. And last, I promise, the years that we're using, not as baseline, you know, technically, but the years that we're using were absolutely the crappiest possible years to do, whether between Metro or COVID or all these. So it's like we better be seeing some growth, but even with that, just systemically, the state has made this a joke. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. Vice President Gray?
So I'm like slightly harking back to a comment that was made a few board meetings ago about, for all the students who got to particular high school, every one of them graduated. For the, you know, and that's a great point to have. It's a great thing. That's a wonderful factor. The struggle is that that's not all the students that go to the high school. So in some of this data, what we're seeing is that the more challenges there are to a student getting to school every day, the more likely it is that we are going to, or the fewer challenges that we see for a student getting to school every day, the more likely we are to see increases in graduation numbers and other things. That would be good signs. I'm also harking back to some of the things that I heard over the last weekend for some of our other districts in other communities, where chronic absenteeism is also tied to factors such as the safety of the communities in which they live in, the safety of their ability to get to and from school, which I think, you know, again, doesn't make anyone feel better that people are suffering some of the same things that we're suffering from. But I think it also goes into a lot of the conversation that that Dr. Moffitt's been leading with the city, which is ensuring that as our students leave our buildings and go out into the communities in which they live in, that those communities are safe. Because I do know that's always been a factor in how some of these schools had chronic absenteeism, is that to get there, even if you live a mile away from the school, where your mile wasn't, you know, half your mile to the school wasn't safe. And so I in some ways hope that as we are able to find solutions towards some of those things, we'll also see a decrease in the chronic absentee number. I did have one kind of question, and just maybe a clarification for the public as well. And I think you brought it up with regard to like a student with a special ed student, a student with disability. If you're pulled out for a doctor's appointment, if you're pulled out because your parents decided we're going to Florida this week, if you're pulled out because you had a health issue for which you needed to leave half the day, that counts against your chronic absenteeism.
There is no such thing as an excused absence versus an unexcused absence. And so if you're pulled out for any reason, it counts against you. That time period counts against you. So in terms of the education piece, it's also educating families around things like that. It's educating, and this is one, and I know that we talked about this in health and safety, but it's educating families of young girls. If you're out of school once a month for 2 days, by the end of the school year, you are chronically absent. Yep. And that equates to a month of school.
And so I think about this also with students with things like, when I was growing up, I had a classmate who had sickle cell. And on a regular basis, they were out for 2 or 3 days a month.
Right.
Related to their health needs. Went to school with a student who had juvenile diabetes.
Right.
Again, out pretty regularly for different health needs. That is just maybe also part of the question at, you know, some level our state does not afford us the opportunity to do a good job of discussing, which is there is a big difference between a student who misses school because they are physically unable to attend school that day and a student who is just not present because they didn't choose to go to school that day. And I think sometimes that's the struggle we have with dealing with chronic absenteeism, is that we think about it in a lot of ways from the students who don't make it for all these other factors, but it also is that student who has health issues, that student who has, whose family is dealing with homelessness or dealing with sporadic housing issues, or, you know, certainly high mobility regard to their housing issue, which may mean they end up at a different place every other night to figure out how to get to school the next day. But that is still very different from a student who either doesn't come or parents don't choose to bring them or these other factors. And so I also, I guess part of me wonders, when we're thinking about the large urban districts, we deal with this in a different way than, again, suburban districts might, and then even some rural districts might, where we have these issues more often to deal with a student who has just general health needs or other factors that might cause them to be absent. So I think that's, again, something else for us to think about. And for parents also recognize, if you take your kid out for a week to go on a trip, you better make sure the rest of that year they're in class every day. Or, you may be looking at a student who's counted towards that absenteeism.
Thank you, Vice President Craig. Superintendent?
The other thing, and thank you for sharing that, but one of the reasons that I wanted to make sure that you had this particular document is because, to Board Member Bolton's point, if you go into the document and you sort from least to greatest, you very quickly begin to see the picture of where you see chronic absenteeism. So it comes into a direct correlation to socioeconomic status. It's based on the overall school environment. In many of our schools where you're not necessarily the Title I school, you don't have as many Title I students, you also know in those schools there, to your point, would be more diversity in terms of more white students in those schools than we have in the other. So I think that there are, to your point and to Board Member Craig's point, there are a lot of other factors that go into this as well, as we think about just the chronic absenteeism piece and how we are able to really work through it. But I think it's important, and I do appreciate that this is one of the guardrails that we're talking about, because it's something that we would have to look at anyway, and it just gives us an opportunity to talk about it with the board. Because even with that, if we increased in this area by just 20%, right, how many more students would that mean that were actually not chronically absent? And I do believe the more that we begin to educate parents and caregivers and families around that, I believe that we will see some improvement just from that, along with the record keeping at the school level. What can we do so that after you started your class, and there are some schools, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, but this has really been one that we've thought about a lot. Being at a high school at 10 o'clock and knowing that, and have been there enough to see a wave of students show up at 10 o'clock. They're just getting to school, they're just walking in and talking to the admin, and they're not doing anything wrong, they're just coming in late. But they're late, and they're late at that time every single day. So we also have to think about, the things that we are also talking about in terms of how we're resourcing our students, where we are with passes and those kinds of things. If we hold the standard for the students, the students will comply with the standard that we give them. But as much as we stretch that standard out, there are some that are going to go with that standard and expectation because that's what we give them as well. So just wanted to share that. I do appreciate the time.
Thank you, Superintendent. Ms. Jones?
Yeah, just a brief comment. I really appreciate this discussion. It's robust. I agree with Ms. Bolton. This is the most comprehensive look that we've had. And when you look at this, and based on the conversation and discussion that we've had as a board about some of the broader issues, this might be an excellent topic in some format to present when we meet with City Council to talk about the broader scope issues. The goal of that meeting is to get things resolved. So we have to let them know kind of where our issues are and how we see, or can form some sort of working relationship or partnership for them to help us with the broader issues. So, and I think I really appreciate this information. They need to see this in some format. So I would suggest that yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Mr. Moraski, have you gone already?
I went once.
Anybody not go yet who would like to go first? Mr. Moraski, I'll go after you.
Thanks, President Lindy. Ms. Jones just triggered me a little bit, and I just want to take on to that. So when I refer to the social determinants of education, and at least, again, in my estimation, this is the most complicated one. as there's so many things out of our control. But to your point, and a lot of it's out of the city's control too, but if there is a governing body who has reached out and said they want to work with us on things, they have a lot of say, or at least influence at the least, over some of these factors that are out there to help get our kids. So I just wanted to give a big adamant second to that.
Thank you, Mr. Moreski. I was just going to share briefly this presentation on the chronic absenteeism in particular feels a lot like the busing piece for me, because it feels like an example of a time when here was a real challenge that we were facing that really matters for students. And then here's an example of a strategy or a choice that the district put into place. In the busing context, it was aligning start times. In the chronic absenteeism context, it was adding those two positions. Neither one of those were decisions without controversy. Both of them had people who really liked them and people who really did not like them. And in both cases, we can see improvement in the data having done those two things. And it's not in a random location, it's on issues that really matter a great deal. And so I think as we look at where is this group of people making an impact in the world, these feel like two really good examples to me, because this was hard. We did something on purpose and saw a response in the data that makes things better for families. And so that makes me very happy, for lack of a better word. But thank you. I think that's great. And thank all of you. I know we got to move along because we got a calendar and other things too. But I think in the future, what I'm excited to hear more about is the story behind the iReady numbers. And what I asked my question earlier about that, but just is this a weird artifact of testing timelines or assessments, or is there something really important here about kids who are not learning as much as we need them to learn? And how do we know which of those scenarios we're in? What's the administration's plan depending on which of those scenarios we're in? But I'm glad that this is not the only time we're going to look at those numbers, and excited to hear more about that as we go forward.
Thank you for both. I think yes to both of those things. And with the iReady piece, that's an area that we're really digging in, because the more I think about it, I do think a better interim start is where the students ended at the end of the school year, because it's closer to where they should be at the opening of the school year versus the fall to fall data. So we're looking at that in terms of comparison. I think that we're going to see a closer correlation in terms of those things, as we should, because there is a difference in, the beginning of the year and then the end of the year, and then where you start at the beginning of the year. The middle, the summer, of course, as is always the case, counts for what we would call summer slide or summer melt. But for the most part, your hope would be that where students end, they start in a commiserate place.
Thank you very much. Anything else on goals or guardrails before we move to calendar? Given the time, let's move to calendar.
Thank you very much. So I do want to start, as we're going into the calendar proposals. We're bringing these now as in working with our union leads, trying to get the calendar recommendations out sooner. The recommendation was that we have the conversation now, give the board an opportunity to do review, and then hopefully bring it back in December. However, I do recall that when I came to the district in May, shortly we were updating and voting on calendars right then. So I don't think that we are in a situation where it has to be done in December. If the will of the board is something different, we can give more time for a review, but I did want to start with that. I also want to thank those that worked on the calendar committee. So if we'll go to the very last slide that's on here. So right there, okay. The calendar committee was made up of all of our union leads, as well as administrators, ELT members, and their representatives, and the treasurer's office, and EMIS. And EMIS is important because that is how we make sure that we have the right number of days that are in the calendar, that we have the days for our elementary schools versus what's needed for our K-8 schools. So do want to give some recognition to those individuals. If we can go back to the beginning. Thank you. So a few calendar recommendations that continue to focus on student learning while supporting students and staff. So just a few highlights. We want to continue the calendar recommendations, the calendar proposals right now continue to include substantially more student hours over the state minimum requirements. And in just a moment, you'll actually see the difference in the breakdown. We have quite a few more days built into our calendar than what the state actually requires for our students. It maintains 5 days for professional development, maintains the student work days at the beginning and the end of the school year, shifts the start date up by 1 day to maintain ending by Memorial Day weekend, which was really important to the calendar committee. Shift spring break up by 1 week to be right after the end of the third quarter, which then gave more time as we prepare and get ready for testing moving into that time, and expands the full week of fall break, a long weekend in October, and a built-in weather day in April. So those things were actually considered based on feedback and put into the proposals. So the proposals here, there are two. We have them as recommendations. We'll work on working with the team to list them moving forward as proposals versus recommendations, but they were given to us as recommendations. So the first continues many additional days above the minimum instructional hours with better semester balance. So if we will look at the first recommendation, the student days for the fall is 83, for the spring is 88, with a total of 171 student days, and then maintaining with the holidays 191 for teachers. The total counting for my screen just went off. Okay, so I'll keep moving from this one until it comes back on. The total for the days counting for the minimum number of hours, 175. That also includes our 2 days of professional development, 2 days of parent-teacher conferences. For our elementary total, we currently have 1,050 hours, which is 6 per day. Our minimum required is 910, so that gives us 23.3 days more than we're required to have. For our secondary totals, it's at 6.5 per day, which is 1137.5. The required amount of time is 1,001. And so that gives us 21 days. I'm looking at the one up here because our screens went out. Yours just came back on. And okay, so that gives us 21 days over what we're required. And then for our K-8, it's 6 per day as well. And currently, this would be the required, which also is inclusive of our 7th and 8th grade students, which gives us 8.2 days overall for what we have in terms of the calendar. And then you see a similar breakdown with our 25-26 recommendation, still giving the same number of days, still the same number of hours that are built in, but I think the next calendar gives you more information in terms of how we're actually looking at those days and where they are. So if we can go to the next. All right, so responding to the data helps guide placement of the breaks to ensure instructional days are maximized. You know, while Mondays and Fridays are always high absent days, we recommended breaks and holidays respond to peak absences. So if we look at the first chart, teacher absences are high around select holidays. The first one, our first PD day is after we do the PD days before the students return. Our first one is September the 26th. That's a high day. That's really one of the highest days that we have in the calendar. It's also the holiday that correlates to that is also Rosh Hashanah. However, it's a PD day. And we noticed that for all of our professional development days, attendance, our absences are higher on those days. In other words, more individuals take off work on those days. So it's a combination of both there. The next one is April the 7th, which is Good Friday. The next one is Easter Monday. And then after that, it goes into the Thanksgiving holidays. There are 3 days above 500 absences when we disaggregate the information, 15 days, 400 to 499, and 19 days at 350 to 399 overall. So that's just teacher absences. Then we think about the absences of the administrators. The admin absences are high also around select times. Of course, one of the biggest times is the 4th of July week when we see the biggest absences for administrators. Of course, teachers are not here during that time, so that's why you see more of the absences during administrators. And then the second week of July is really there's as many absences almost the second week of July as there is the 4th of July week. And then during the Christmas and New Year's holidays, because the way that the calendar is organized right now, administrators work some of those days. Teachers don't work any of that time once students leave, but administrators have days that are mixed into that time where they work, and so they take that time off. The same for Thanksgiving Tuesday. Most are out. There's a conference day generally that Wednesday, but the Tuesday before is higher than some other days, Good Friday and then Thanksgiving Monday. At the bottom of this particular chart, teacher and cast absences by date can be seen at that link. So if you'll click that link for me. This allows you to see across the board the date and the absences that are on those dates. At the bottom, we see 2023 is for CAS and 2022 for CAS, and then 2023 for teachers. So this was also used in some of the conversation as well, but it gives it to you by date. We also organized that so that you could again see what the largest days were and the largest number of absences were and what that correlated to the day of the week. We can go back to the next slide. Okay, next slide. So this one shows the colors, which makes it a little bit easier to see in terms of the recommendations. So at the very top, the first day of school, I'll start before first day of school. So our teacher work days are in yellow. So if you look at this particular slide, you see the 3 days that are built in as teacher work days. One of the days before students come back is actually a district, 2 of the days is a district-wide PD day. So those are the yellow. The next is purple, and the purple represents the first day of school. So the recommendation for 24-25, the recommendation would be for the first day of school to start on Wednesday the 14th. And for 25-26, the recommendation would still be on a Wednesday, but the date that week would be the 13th. Both of these slides, if you'll look at the holiday break, that would be next, and that would mean that all of CPS is closed on those days. So the holiday breaks would be, they're represented in green. In terms of looking at what those dates are, they're listed out here on the slides for when they would be. Calling particular attention to the orange as well as only when schools are closed. So that means staff members would work during that time. And then a weather makeup day. So that's building in a day so that if we had to use it because of snow, we could then take that day off. Or that day would be a day that we did not work unless we had to use it as a makeup day for inclement weather. So a couple of notes, it feels like an early start. And that's because the focus of the group was to get all of the days in before Memorial Day, so that teachers and that students were out of school by the Thursday or Friday before Memorial Day. And both of these calendars allow for that to happen. Starting in 2026 until 2034, the whole calendar will shift back by 1 week. And then 2, the weather makeup day for Good Friday would only be used if we had to take that day off, because if we had to make up that day because earlier in the year we had a weather day that needed to be looked at. The other day I think that's it. Otherwise, that would be a day off for school. If we go to where it says click here, that allows us to see the calendars in the full version, if that's easier for everyone. So it opens them up so that you're able to see both of them in both of the difference. So that's one, both of these are full versions. So one is 24-25 and the other is 25-26. Let's go to the next. So let's stop here. Want to make sure that I want to make sure I'm not missing anything else that I needed to call out here specifically. Holiday break. Yes. Okay. So, and there was a lot of conversation around October the 11th, which I do understand is Yom Kippur. I believe the 11th. Is that right? Is that right? Okay. And so that would be a day that's been added to the calendar that would serve as a holiday break. So all the schools would be closed during that time, which would avoid the teachers taking off during that time as a high takeoff day. Let's go to the next. So the calendar refresh also addresses the opportunity to clarify and any negative payroll impacts for hourly staff. I will say that the level pay for hourly staff would be discussed through the collective bargaining process. It's not something that's just automatic, but it is something that's come up for discussion, and we do anticipate that that would be discussed as a part of the process in terms of leveling the pay for staff. So the current setup is a bit confusing. Employees are confused about which days they work and which days they're off. Payroll for hourly staff is reduced on weeks when schools are closed, typically holidays or weekends. And there are days when one group is at school and they're supposed to work, but no one else is supposed to do that. So really trying to make sure that there's some opportunity for some cleanup in terms of that. Starting for the 24-25 year, the goal is to have school-based employees, not year-round, but the school-based are off on all days that schools are closed, and that would be the orange and green days from the other calendar. Payroll for hourly staff hopefully would be leveled so that when there are their holidays, it doesn't have a negative impact on those employees. And central office and year-round employees are off on all the days that the district is closed, which would be the green days versus the back and forth of who works those days and who doesn't. The important part about this is that all of the recommendations of this are cost neutral to the district and to the employee. So it allows us to maximize time, be more strategic about when individuals are working, but not cost the district any additional funding. And I think that might be, and that's the last one. So I'll stop here, open up for questions or comments or concerns.
Thank you, Superintendent. And the request from us tonight is for feedback on the calendar. It'll come for approval at a future date, or are you looking for approval tonight?
Correct. No, the request tonight is only for feedback, give you an opportunity to review it,
Gotcha.
have any additional questions that you have. Our desire would be to come back in December. I think we only have one business meeting in December. We do have two. So the desire would be to come back to the second business meeting in December for an approval so that we could begin to socialize with staff.
Got it. Thank you, Superintendent. Any feedback or reactions for
Will you go back to
administration?
the two calendars that were up, please? Thank you.
Starting with Dr. Moffitt.
So I don't ever want to disagree if everybody loved it and they're in the trenches and they're living it, but I do have a couple questions. So historically, students don't come until after Labor Day. Like, we don't get our mass influx of students until that day. And we're talking about adding a day before Labor Day. So I was a little concerned with that because, because I'm just like, well, I've talked to way too many parents and I don't understand it, but I think historically speaking, decades ago, there used to be a start after Labor Day. And so I'm wondering about that. Starting school earlier in August seems a little counterproductive to me if historically they don't get our accurate numbers until after Labor Day. And then I have a question about why what's the rationale behind ending before Memorial Day? Why did we have to do that? But before you answer that, I also am interested in the data around the work from home. I think all of our departments, for the most part, when you mentioned central office, except for one, are able to work from home. So I'm wondering, have we seen a decrease in absenteeism from the departments that are able to work from home? Why can't all of our departments work from home? And then the Memorial Day, ending the school before Memorial Day, and then the start of school in August when the data is different than that.
Okay, so let's start with the data first. It was shared with us earlier, and I don't remember if it was this year or last year, that we don't get an influx of students until after Labor Day. It was shared with us at that time because of the conversation around leveling when we were going through the TAC process. We went back and pulled the data. The difference was a difference of about 30 students. So based on the students that did not come until after Labor Day. And so I think maybe in years past, maybe that's been the case. But from the most recent data that the team pulled for the last several years, that's not been the case. So I think that people still think that that's the case, but it's really not. So the students have been socialized to come before Labor Day. The second thing is, I think that I just think it's past practice that there is a lot of interest from all of the individuals that were on the committee and the feedback that has been received from staff, specifically teachers, that getting out of school before Labor Day, before Memorial Day, also addresses some of the concerns that you begin to see with increased attendance after Memorial Day. So if school is already closed before Memorial Day happens, then you're not looking at trying to get individuals to come back after Memorial Day and extending it beyond that. So there was a lot of focus and a lot of conversation around making sure that, school was closed by Memorial Day, and by the Friday before Memorial Day, so that you're not then dealing with the students returning after that. The third question in terms of chronic absenteeism, if you go back to where we have the list of the absences right here, if you'll click there for me. So all of our departments that are not school facing, that are not school based, i.e. school buildings, district staff can work from home, depending on the role that they do. So obviously our carpenters aren't working from home, our painters aren't working from home. I think you understand what I mean in terms of that.
At my home.
But the other departments, through their direct report and the policy that the policy committee brought to the board last year, there is work from home for them. That does not count as a part of their attendance. So if we go, it doesn't count as an absence for them. So if we go into absences here, if we click the absence right there, we can then take this and review for the last couple of years. Most of those would be in CAS. You have 2 years of CAS data here. If we go to our 2022 data for CAS, next one over, yes, that's 2022, if we'll open that one. Okay, and then from here, we could do the same thing in terms of disaggregating for you, or just looking at to see if there is a difference in terms of the overall attendance. Collectively, there doesn't seem to be a huge difference in individuals taking off versus not taking off when you're just looking at the two sets. You may see some different nuances on specific days, but for the most part, the averages are about the same.
I was just wondering, is the ability to work from home assisting with the staff absences for those departments that can work from home? Is that helping? That was.
I think in terms of looking at it, it's about the same. And this is specific. Most of the individuals that would be ones that can work from home are in CAS, and so that gives specific information around that.
And then when is the testing for the spring over? Because I know we lose a lot of students more than Memorial Day. We lose them after testing is over. So
end of April. End of April, early May. So one of the lessons learned from last year with our panorama data, which we'll talk about briefly on Monday, was just the same thing. After, about the second week in May, attendance is almost null and void, which also impacts chronic absenteeism.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moffitt. Other questions or feedback on the calendar? Ms. Bolton.
Yes, thank you. I'm looking at what we have to do and for the 5-year forecast and what have you. I'm glad that this is cost neutral, but I don't understand why there isn't a way to make the calendar save us money somewhere. And I know what that could be. We can talk a lot about all of that. The other thing, and I say this, everybody's listened to me say this year after year, or at least periodically, I guess. I hate to negotiate away the calendar because the calendar is a really important item when other people negotiate contracts. So we take that kind of out of ours and out of theirs. So I worry. I'm glad that we're trying to get ahead of the game, and our families deserve to know, but the calendar is a really big deal in negotiation. And I would hate for us to kind of give up that chip, or for them to give up that chip, as well as this not having enough opportunity to maybe save some money with the school year that we invent. And we have a long school year because of all the stuff we build into it.
Right.
I mean, we don't have a long, you make the point that we do more than the state requires, but we all know how I feel about the state, so I never try to use them as a standard. But are we, you say that we're going to continue to do more than the state requires in this calendar, are there less contact hours in these next 2 years than contact meaning students, or instructional time, the way I just define it, contact with students? Are there less hours, less days where the students are having contact with instruction?
Not in either of these calendars. As we begin to open up the budget conversations, when it's time for us to do that, I do think that that's one of the items that is to be discussed, because across the board, we have a lot more days than we're required to have, but that it opens two different conversations. One is contact time with the students. The other is the work days for staff. And so it's really whether or not there is appetite around both of those. But there's some opportunity to have some discussion. For our middle school students, and I say middle school, for our schools that are K-8, we are currently about 8.2 days over what's required. The other ones, it's more like 20. But for that population, with the nuances of what's required, we're about 8 days over.
And I continue to have an issue with how that's figured out, from a standpoint, if we're teaching many more days than the state requires and we're still getting the outcomes that we're getting, obviously we need to do something more. And obviously after COVID, the idea was to how can we increase instructional time, not decrease it. But I'm glad that all of this is being discussed. I think it all has to be there. And the 5, I like the balanced semesters. I think that's fair. But I also have a number of other concerns that we don't have to do tonight. But the organizing, not just the semester balance, but also the religious holidays and what have you. Those holidays, does this new proposal for these 2 years, does it build in holidays around any of those religious holidays, so that indeed there is less absenteeism? And I'm real interested to know the percentage of the workforce when we talk about teacher absence versus administrative absence. I need a percentage rather than numbers, but we can write some of this stuff down and send to you rather than belabor the point. But there's some really big issues here regarding the length of this school year. And I know in previous years, people count instructional days, even the days that it's PD. I mean, that's our old calendar would actually list instructional days, and it wasn't, they didn't divide it up until a few years ago of student contact, versus thinking that PD or teacher conference or whatever was instructional time. Of course it's not. It's development time, it's whatever, but it sure isn't contact with kids. So we'll jot some of these things down. But the big one is the negotiations and the cost piece.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. Other comments or feedback on the calendar? I have a couple of things. I'll go real quick. I think, thank you for all the presentation. I think it looks really good. I think you anticipated some of my questions around holidays. I appreciate the attention to the Jewish holidays in the fall. I want to say thank you. I think an idea for the future that I wanted to share, I think that the group of people who worked on this feels like it does a fabulous job representing labor organizations and the administration. I think all those perspectives matter. I think having a group of diverse religious perspectives on the holidays of multiple faiths as a lens to evaluate the calendar could be a really good and healthy thing that is in line with our equity policy. If we have time to look at this through that kind of lens, that sounds great. If we don't, I understand, and I'm wondering if we could put it in place for the future. But that feels like an easy win and would bring in some perspectives that we don't have necessarily from the current group. The other piece I was going to share is, you don't have to change anything, but on the 11th of October, Jewish holidays always start at sundown. So that day actually is not as big a problem because it would start that night. But I think people will appreciate it anyway. So it might be worth leaving it alone. But I think the bigger piece is not just for my own personal background, but for other people's. Is there a way to make sure that this does the best job we can in the future?
Thank you, and thank you for the feedback collectively. And as I started the conversation, I am open either way. We wanted to honor the request that was done, but maybe that request was made strategically because of what Board Member Bolton shared. The team has put a lot of work in here, so I think providing that feedback to me, if you will do that, and then we can follow back up with them, have them to kind of go in and make some additional recommendations based on that. I am not opposed at all to having different populations to review the calendar at this point and give some feedback on that. I think that that's a healthy exercise now as well, especially because we're not pressed for time in terms of trying to get this out and get this done. And so we're ahead of the game right now in terms of this, and we wanted to make sure that we were there, in terms of thinking about where we have been previously.
Any other last comments or questions, Mrs. Weinberg?
Yes, I'm just going to add my little bit of comment on the calendar. Actually, I just pulled up the calendar of this current year, and I pulled up the calendar of the year before. And when you put them side by side, I'm going to say that I actually like the calendar. I'm going to put it out there. When I'm looking at the dates, last year, for example, school started on the 17th. You're now proposing school to start on the 14th. Some of the dates you moved up spring break, which is just a week earlier rather than a week later. We are still getting out of school on the 23rd here on the current calendar proposal. It's May the 20, is it the 22nd or the 23rd? Can't see it. Yeah, for the last day of school. What day is
The
it?
last day for this coming year would be the 26th.
Okay, so it's an extra couple of days, but what I think would maybe also help.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. The last day for students would be the 22nd.
Okay, so I think also looking at this particular calendar, and what I liked about this year's calendar is afterwards you listed out all of the dates and explained everything. And so I think if some of my colleagues maybe seeing that as well would be able to, excuse me, compare and be able to see that they are very similar. And there are a couple of changes, but they are similar. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Weinberg. Any other last comments or questions? So I think before we adjourn, just a couple of very quick things from me, mostly in the housekeeping department. On our agenda for this evening, as I pull it up here, bear with me, everybody. We have gotten through our first presentation on progress monitoring. We have gotten through our second presentation on school calendar. I was originally going to suggest that we recess into executive session this evening to cover a couple of topics, but I'm looking at the time, and I'm fine adjourning for this evening so long as people are able to engage in an executive session come November 6th. Is that acceptable to everybody?
I don't need to think. I'm
see
okay with that.
Mrs. Weinberg.
I would be fine with that. In addition, would my topics from last time that were missed be added on?
We'll do as much as we can
Okay,
fit
thank you.
in the time that we have. I think or we can also adjourn, we can do tonight, Mrs. Weinberg, like if people would prefer.
No, I'm fine with
Okay.
Monday.
Okay, okay. So we'll do that on Monday. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have these board priorities. I think we did a really nice job this evening of spending the majority of our time on progress monitoring and accountability. I've had a great conversation with Dr. Moffitt and enjoyed going to the most recent ad hoc committee meeting. And I'm excited to have some recommendations coming, I believe, on December the 4th, coming up in about a month. So we're moving forward on all these priorities. The last one was budget. We didn't do much on that tonight, but I wanted to thank the board again for our Saturday meeting in October. I know we shared our support at that meeting as a board for the work that the superintendent and treasurer would be doing in the coming months to figure out what kinds of changes to our FY25 budget would close the size of the gap that we're looking at. And I wanted to thank everyone for their hard work on that front. I'm not sure if there are any updates from the administration at this point. There may not be, but is there anything that you all want to share regarding how that work is going?
I think the only thing that I would share very quickly is as a follow-up to the Finance Committee meeting, I did bring just a a draft flyer of the roundtable conversations that we are looking to have around budget. A couple of things in terms of that. The roundtables were born out of feedback from last year. Number one. Number two, they're using a similar format to what we did for our transportation roundtables and our strategy conversations. The third is we will also, we will record the sessions, so they will be live and they'll also be recorded. And at the end of them, we will have a survey for feedback. Our goal is at least 2,000 responses on that survey to get feedback for the overall budget. We recognize that our purpose is to get as much information as we can to then bring back proposals to the board for how to address where we are with budget. We know that a few things are going to happen right now because they've already started happening. And the same thing happened last year, and it happens in every school district in every budget cycle where there's going to be a change. Individuals have already started lobbying. They started reaching out to you. They started reaching out to us. That is a part of their role in terms of trying to share what their value is. The reality is we want to get as much information as we can and share that back in terms of the proposals for how we get to and recommend what's in terms of what's balanced. So I have asked the board, I've shared the dates with the board. I have asked if you are planning to attend a date, if you'll please let me know that you're planning to attend a date. I would hopefully that would be a date that I would be able to attend as well, so that we are in that space at the same time, because we do want to make sure initially I will do, the treasurer and I will start those conversations, and then we'll have the team that's involved in getting that information back as well. And then at the end of all of that, we'll share it with the board and begin to talk about where we are in terms of next steps. But we're looking for input across all stakeholders. That includes parents, it includes students, it includes staff, it includes community stakeholders, partners, vendors. However we define that, we're looking for feedback from all.
Thank you very much. Any comments or questions from board members before we adjourn? Having no other business before us, I declare our meeting adjourned.